Fanny Crosby was a hymn writer, probably 400 hymns that she wrote that in our hymnals that you would recognize if we moved into that. She was a small child, had a mustard poultice that was misapplied to her eyes that left her blind. And so the hymns that she wrote were written as a woman suffering from a lifelong blindness. And she didn't always write the music, but people would bring music to her and she would provide the lyrics. One of my favorites is called Rescue the Perishing. And it says, rescue the perishing, care for the dying, snatch them in pity from sin and the grave, weep o'er the erring one, lift up the fallen, tell them of Jesus, the mighty to save. And then the chorus, rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Though they are slighting him, still he is waiting the penitent child to receive. Plead with them earnestly, plead with them gently. He will forgive if they'd only believe. Down in the human heart, crushed by the tempter, feelings lie buried that grace touched by a loving heart, wakened by kindness, chords that were broken will vibrate once more. And then the final verse, rescue the perishing. Duty demands it. Strength for thy labor, the Lord will provide. Back to the narrow way, patiently win them. Tell the poor wanderer, Savior has died. Our focus this quarter has been to talk about how do you do that? How do we do that in a 21st century context? We read stories in the first century of people who've done that, and we're called to follow their example. And we base this from Matthew 28, where Jesus has said, make disciples. And as you do that, teach them to observe everything I've told you to do. He said that to the 12, and they have taught others who taught others, told us. And so therefore we are now beholden to do those things as well. And so we have looked at, of course, the Gospel Fried Egg. And so we've talked about the fact that that it all starts and ends with our understanding of our identity in Christ, shaped by the gospel, and then that flows out into community and then into mission. And so we talked about lift. And so we are, anyone? Loved, included, forgiven, and transformed, continually transformed. That's right. And so as we have been lifted, then we ought also to lift one another, if you will, to love one another, to include and honor one another, to forgive one another, and to stimulate others to Christ likeness, to love and good deeds, the continual transformation that he accomplishes through the mystery and glory of community, and then into mission, which is to make disciples. And so we started looking at what that means, and we spent 3 weeks talking about the two-headed duck and unpacking what that means. Ministry, of course, in community, and the duck heads representing proclamation and demonstration. And so we're to show the gospel and we're to share the gospel. We're to give examples of the gospel. We're also to explain the gospel. I can do this all day. Alliteration is my love language. And so we spent a good bit of time last week. Of course, we were encouraged by the testimonies that we saw last week and hearing about the every member commitment and the work of the past year. And so we're back again. Thus, we're going to press in now to some specifics. The last few weeks that we have here this month. When we were younger, you and I, 70s, 80s, 90s, most of the society that we lived in would agree with these basic premises. The people that we would engage with at work or at school, if you can remember back that far, most everybody agreed that they were created. They may not agree on how we were created or the source of that creation and where the Big Bang played into the creation, but most people agree there was a designer and there's a design and we were created, that there is a moral law outside of ourselves that determines right and wrong. We used to call it common sense, but that's how common it was in society. And so this is wrong and this is right. That we are not good enough. We do not measure up to that moral law. Thus, it is a moral law outside of ourselves that we ascribe to, that we need each other to spur us on to, that we need help, that we need laws that hold us accountable when we fall short. And if we fall too short, there were ramifications that involved imprisonment and other things. And that there is a need for justice and a need for forgiveness because we fall short of that external moral law. And how can that happen? And who makes that happen? And we were primarily in a Christianized culture, if you will. And so the world would have remarkable agreement with those basic tenets. And so ministry, the process of making disciples, looked a lot like connecting the dots for people. These things that they largely heard and understood, and that Jesus was kind of the skeleton key, if you will, to all of those pieces. And so 20% of the people roughly in society really believed all that. And so Jesus was the solution. 80% accepted those things as truth, but it took some persuasion, the process of evangelism, to help them come to an understanding that Jesus was that. So evangelism was almost reminding them in some ways of what they had heard in other contexts. I've told the story too many times to remember, but I think in this class we talked about the fact that the Campus Outreach Ministry at Sanford largely started with this situation, and so many students being reminded of what they had heard in their largely Baptist churches at the time. And when they discovered, oh, it's Jesus, this aha of understanding, so many young people coming to Christ that Camp Service was kicked off the campus initially because the backlash of the parents going, what are you doing to my kids? The word cult got thrown around a lot back in those days, because it wasn't a new gospel, but it was an understanding of the gospel for themselves. Now, in the 21st century, we live in a situation where those things are no longer understood or believed. In fact, as opposed to the view that we are created, most people in our broader society would say that they define themselves, that they create truth. There's not an objective moral law. Truth is what they determine is true. You do you. The heart wants what the heart wants, and they set the standard. And so what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. And those things I don't have to overlap. And it's not impossible or impractical for those things to exist, contradict one another, and yet be simultaneously true. It's illogical in many ways. Others just have to accept me, or they have to face justice. Interesting thought as well. What does that mean? Justice from you? Would you have to face my justice if you don't accept my truth? Who gets to determine which truth or which justice is superior? And God, it would not be as you and I would define him as he has defined himself in Scripture, but rather God is the problem, that religion is the source of conflict and turmoil and divisiveness. And so God is the problem, and especially his followers, and that we are the bad guys. And so when that is true, when that is the situation we find ourselves in, Mr. Keller would say, how then do you evangelize people who lack any sense of sin or transcendence, who lack the traditional basic religious infrastructure, such as belief in a supreme being or the afterlife? The church in the West has not faced this situation before. Our old tools don't make sense anymore. The evangelism explosion process is based off an awful lot of assumptions when you knock on that door. Typically, they have showed up at church already, and so we go and visit them, which presupposes a certain set of those dots. But the vast majority of the culture is not showing up to visit on Sunday to be visited. Many of our neighbors and our coworkers have been to church and left and aren't interested in what the church has to say. They've deconstructed their faith, or they've never been to a church. Melody Hunt, who works with me in Camp Sarah, she and John were in Thailand for 27 years. They've returned to the States and are serving in a member care role now. And Melody was headed up to Minnesota about 6 months ago. She was on a flight from here to Minnesota, from Birmingham on Delta, and sat down beside a 16-year-old boy. And in the course of the conversation, began to talk to him about what she had done in Thailand and about Jesus. And he had never heard of Jesus. The 16-year-old boy in Birmingham, Alabama. I don't have a box for that in my head. I know it's true. I believe Melody, but that seems impossible to me. And that's Birmingham, Alabama. That's not even Portland or Seattle or San Francisco. And so when we face this reality around us, our old tools don't make sense. They're answering questions that people simply aren't asking. And so we're missionaries. We're all missionaries. My having lived in China doesn't make me a missionary or a former missionary. We are all missionaries today. Whether we realize it or not is another thing. Mr. Keller actually has written a new book this year called Winning the West Again. That's where this particular passage is taken from. It's an ebook. You can get it for free. You go to the Gospel in Life website, you sign up, and they'll send you a PDF copy of it. It's like 35 pages. It's not really that long. It's not complicated, the process, but it is a helpful read that I would recommend to you. We make cars in this state, whether it's Montgomery and the Hyundai plant or Vance, the Mercedes-Benz plant, or Lincoln and the Honda plant. We talked about this in this class. Have I used this illustration already? Okay, so if you go over to Vance, they'll give you a tour, and they'll tell you that they can make a car in 3 hours. It's not exactly true. They assemble a car in 3 hours, but to make a car takes a lot longer. You got to take sand and make it into glass. You got to take steel and press it into, or aluminum and press it into those body panels. You've got to take leather or plastic that feels like leather and make it into seats. And so they get the seats and the windshields and the panels already assembled when the supply chain works, and it all is there. Now they're just waiting on the chips to show up, and then they'll actually assemble the car, right? Yesterday we were in Atlanta and drove past the sign that said every Honda Pilot in the world is built in Lincoln, Alabama. Every Honda Ridgeline in the entire world is built in Lincoln, Alabama. A lot of them sitting there waiting for the computer chips, but they're assembled, they're not made. But if you ask one of the engineers in Lincoln or Vance or Montgomery, how long does it really take to build that Mercedes or that Honda? Weeks. And that's where we are right now in ministry in America. What used to take basically the reminding or the assembling of disciples, we are very much in a making disciples situation. And one of the unique privileges of campus ministry is typically an engagement with the culture about historically 10 to 15 years before the church realizes it. Because campuses are where our future culture is coming from. And so when you have campus ministry staff engaging with 18 to 22-year-olds, they're about to be 10 to 15 years, the 35 to 40-year-olds that are shaping and influencing the broader culture. Now, because of this particular machine, smartphone, for those of you who can't see me anymore because you're sharing the screen, because of the smartphone and the pace at which culture is now spread and linked, it's no longer 15 to 20-year lags. The culture that is being shaped by our institutions of higher learning is rapidly spreading across the broader culture. And so the time lag is shorter. And so that's the reality that we're facing, is we have to make disciples differently than we have historically engaged with it as a church community in the West, and in many ways at Briarwood and Birmingham. So what is a disciple? That's a crucial question if we're going to make disciples. And so I put this up here as an example, not as a final definition. I would encourage you and your family to sort through and wrestle with Jesus over what is a disciple. But I put this up as an example. A disciple is a person plugged into the church, not this church necessarily, but the church of Jesus Christ, plugged into the church to live out a Christ-centered identity with spirit-filled character, is governed by a biblical, I should have said life and worldview to be reader consistent, but a biblical worldview that engages persuasively among non-Christians and is equipped to multiply this lifestyle in others. There's 6 marks in there that I would just highlight for you. An identity shaped by Jesus, community of followers of Jesus, character shaped by Christ through the Spirit, under the authority of the Word, engaged in evangelism, and able to disciple others. How you want to word it, whether you want to add more, totally up to you. But I think those 6 characteristics are crucial in understanding what it means to make a disciple, to build a disciple there. The one we're going to focus on this morning is this engages persuasively among non-Christians. In Acts chapter 26, Paul has been arrested and he is being held by Felix. And the Jewish leaders are wanting to try Paul and really ultimately get into Jerusalem, and they can assassinate him on the way. And Paul finds out about it, and so he appeals his case to Caesar. And so, because he's a Roman citizen, every Roman citizen had that right. They could appeal to have their case heard by Caesar. And so Felix says, great, you appeal to Caesar, it's off my hands, off to Rome you go. And he's just trying to figure out when and how to send him. And his big angst is, what does he put in the summary of the legal record to send with him? Because there's really no case against Paul. It's all trumped up junk. But now he's got to send him to Caesar. And while he's waiting, King Agrippa shows up. And so they're discussing it over dinner and probably some, barbecue or whatever. And while they're talking about it, Agrippa says, this is fascinating. And Felix is like, man, I need your advice. I have no idea what to tell Caesar to know about the case, to give him this briefing summary. You got any thoughts? And Agrippa says, trot him out here and let's hear him. And I'm happy to throw my profound expertise and understanding into the ring here, maybe get a little political benefit out of having my name on the recommendation or whatnot. And so next day they gather everybody, huge pomp and circumstance, of course. Agrippa and his wife come in and they bring Paul out in chains and they say, so here's the deal, explain to him what's going on. And so he proceeds to share the gospel. He reviews the history of what's happened. He shares his testimony. And in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about how do we share our testimony in this context. And I'm going to use Paul's example to talk about how we can share our gospel in a way that's persuasively engaging non-Christians. And Paul's just a great example here. But when he gets to the end, Agrippa says, hey, in such a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? It's a phenomenal sentence. I mean, this is the king of the area or whatnot, with Felix the judge there, the Roman ruler, and Paul is sharing his testimony, and he didn't call for a decision. There is no point in which he says, if you're gonna surrender all, you have to be all surrendered. And so if you've never surrendered to Christ, I'm going to ask you here at the end of the service, there's none of that. He is sharing his story in such a way as the Spirit is working in Felix and Agrippa's heart, that Agrippa goes, hey, are you trying to persuade me to become a Christian? Now, Paul didn't back down from that. Paul says, whether short time or long time, I love that. Whether it happens in one conversation or whether it happens over weeks and months, I don't care. I would to God that not only, oh shoot, why am I running long? This is fully charged. It's going to be painful if that goes out. I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am. Well, except for these chains. We'll be nice to have these taken off. So I would hope that all of us, as we move through our day, would have such a situation, that the Lord would open up opportunities, that we would easily and effectively engage in persuasive conversation among non-believers, that they would say, it's almost as if you would want me to be a Christian too. So there it went.